So thanks so much for attending. So I'm going to talk about this paper that I'm currently working on. So any feedback, very welcome. So it's about this thing called the challenge from adoption to the permissibility of procreation. Let me see if I can move between slides. Yeah. So this is can you see the slide? This is like a day change. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about what this challenge is and why it challenges the permissibility of procreation, and then the argument that underpins the challenge, sorry, and then two responses that I sort of have to this argument, and then some concluding remarks. In the sort of longer version of the paper, which I realize I wouldn't have time to go into today, I also talk about another version of the challenge that is just to assisted procreation. So to using fertility technology such as IVF to have children. But today I'm just focusing on natural procreation. But if you have questions about this other part, I'm really happy to talk about it. Okay, so here is the challenge. So the challenge says something that the desire to procreate does not justify bringing new children into existence, as worldwide there are lots of children who live in institutions or with parents who are not able or willing to care for them and look after them adequately. So the idea you're not justified to bring new children, given that there are so many children who need parents. So, in this view, people who wish to have children ought to fulfill what we think of as the interest in parenthood by adopting children rather than procreate. So, this is the challenge. I put some of the people in brackets that defend various versions of the challenge. I think the most influential is Tina Rulli, also has a few papers on this. But recently, in a book that Laura Ferracioli wrote, the first author, she has a second half of the book is also on this topic. Just a few clarification before I go into the argument. So the duty bearers are it's not everyone in society, but people who already wish to have children. So the reason for this is that having children is considered quite burdensome, and I mean obviously joyful and everything, but let's say like the responsibility and the duties associated with being a parent, it would be a lot to ask to people who don't already want to have children to fulfill their duties toward children in need. So the idea is that people who wish to have children already are willing to bear the costs associated with parenthood, and so would only have to bear the costs associated with the idea of foregoing biological parenthood in order to adopt. So the duty bearers are strictly people who wish to have children. I'm going to try to put pressure on this because I don't think it works on their argument, but I'm just describing the idea at the moment. And then the nature of the duty to adopt is that it's a duty to rescue. So the idea that if it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening, you ought to do it. And again, I'm going to explain this. But yeah, the grounding of the duty to adopt is in this more general duty, the duty to rescue that falls in this case on people who wish to have children. And then, sorry, I can't say. Okay. And then the fulfillment of the duty requires specifically adoption rather than other forms of aid. So the idea is that if you fulfill this duty, you can only do so by adopting children rather than, say, for example, donating to charities that improve the conditions of children in institutions. So it's a very narrow, in a certain way, understanding of the duty to rescue, because there is only one way to fulfill it. And the reason for this, if anyone's curious, is because I'm just going to be quick on this, is because the idea is that children need loving parents and loving homes in order to flourish. So it wouldn't be enough to like donate money to improve institutions, because that's not how you fulfill your duty to rescue. Okay, so these are just a certain clarification. So here is the argument. So the argument is on the face of it quite simple. So I'm just gonna lay out the argument, and then I'm gonna explain now the proponents of the argument defend the more contentious premises. So okay, the first premise is that lacking basic nutrition and medical care and being exposed to neglect and abuse harms children. Then there is a sort of principle that underpins the duty to rescue. So if one can prevent something harmful from occurring at little cost to herself, she's morally required to prevent it. And then worldwide, many children lack basic nutrition and medical care and are being exposed to neglect and abuse. People who wish to have children can prevent serious harm to these children at little cost to themselves by adopting them rather than procreating to fulfill their interest in parenthood. Therefore, people who wish to have children are morally required to adopt these children rather than procreate. So this is not an argument that is put forward by one person. This is my sort of interpretation of many of the views that in various ways underpin the challenge from adoption to the permissibility of procreation. So I'm going to go through a couple of the premises that are potentially a bit contentious and then respond to it. So the second premise of the argument is this idea of the principle underpinning the duty to rescue, according to which if one can prevent something harmful from happening at little or occurring at little cost to herself, she's morally required to prevent it. So a famous case in which this principle is discussed and not really defended, but the case is used to elicit our intuitions concerning our obligation in this case, is the drowning child. So the drowning child is a really famous case. I've given this talk a few times, so I'm still not sure if everyone knows it, but probably everyone knows it. So forgive me if I'm repeating something, but I just want to make sure we are all on the same page. So the drowning child is the famous case devised by Singer in 1972, where a passerby is walking, or somebody passes by a pond, and there is a little child drowning. And the idea is that obviously the passersby has an obligation to rescue this child, given that the cost to herself of rescuing the child is getting some mud or very nice clothes. So there are a few versions of the case, but the cost incurred by the rescuer is always either getting mud on their clothes or being a bit late to work. So the idea is that if we think that the passersby has an obligation to rescue the child, we are committed, at least this is what Singer says, we are committed to versions of this principle. Now, in this formulation, I think the principle is not contentious or difficult to defend in any ways, and the same, and also the obligations of the passerby in drowning child are also quite straightforward. Some of the defenders of the duty to adopt use this case, whereas others devise their own. So I'm just going to read one of the common ones. So Ruli has this case called Railroad. So she says, your route to work takes you across the railroad tracks. Today, as you approach the tracks, you notice a small child who has gotten her foot caught in them. A train will be coming by any moment now. Will be coming by any moment now. The child risks losing her leg and possibly even her life if you do not get out of your car and pull her from the tracks. So Rulli, a bit like in the drowning child, and also I take that, of course, you should save the child from the approaching train and rescue the child in the drowning child case. So neither Rulli nor other defenders of the duty to adopt, nor also Singer, provide a positive defense of the principle in P2. They just sort of say, look, if you're committed to a certain type of reading of these cases, which is, of course, you need to save the child, then you will be committed to, or will you accept this principle? Then P4, I think, is a bit different because it is more contentious. So the premise that people who wish to have children can prevent serious harm to these children at little cost to themselves by adopting rather than procreating. So the idea that it's weird to think for people who have a strong desire to procreate, which includes not just having biologically related children, but it be, for example, having a procreative project with your partner and the sort of intimacy that goes with it, but also for some people experiencing gestation and all sorts of other reasons. So it doesn't just need to be the desire to have genetically related children. It can be other things that are also associated with this desire to procreate. So for them, if this desire is strong, I'm happy to talk about it being a desire and not necessarily an interest. The cost to themselves, is the subjective perceived cost of foregoing procreation, would be quite substantial. But some of the proponents of the duty to adopt, such as, for example, Friedrich, he says that people have mistaken beliefs about adoption. So people think that it's very hard to adopt, that it's hard to develop a bond, so there are sort of factual mistakes that make it such that the cost is very high. But if only we could get the sort of epistemically correct beliefs about adoption, then we wouldn't find the costs so significant. So this is one response to the sort of worry that the costs are not minimal or little. And then Rulli says that the reasons why the costs are perceived as so big is that we have morally objectionable views about procreative parenting. So she thinks that it is incompatible with being a virtuous parent, the idea of desiring the child to have certain features, for example, being biologically related to us. So we might have the correct beliefs, but we have the morally wrong, the sort of epistemically correct beliefs, but we have the morally wrong beliefs because we shouldn't care so much about this feature. So it's true that the costs are high, says, or substantial, says Rulli, but they shouldn't be, they are only as such because we are morally dubious parents. Okay, so this is the sort of argument, and I have two responses to the argument. One that takes as a point of departure the current context of adoption, and the other sort of idealized cases of adoption. So I'm going to start with the first. So I'm not the first one to note, and this is why my paper was rejected the first time, because apparently I should have said that, and so now I'm saying it. I'm not the very first one to note that adoption in the current context is costly for people, not just for people who already have a strong desire to have children, but in general can be costly. So both those that believe that there is a duty to adopt and those that deny and argue against this view, and sympathetic ones like Reader, so sort of people in the middle, they all note that adoption in the current context is costly. So even people who say that people who wish to have children have a duty to adopt say that in the current context, fulfilling this duty imposes big cost on prospective parents. So they note that, for example, adoption can be financially burdensome, noting, and this is very US-centric, but noting, for example, that the agency fees can be very high. They say that it is logistically complex, so that, for example, it entails long waiting times and a lot of scrutiny from social workers and so on. And finally, this is a sentence, so this is an expression that is not mine, but is by Magnusson, who wrote a recent paper against the duty to adopt. So he says they are essentially costing in the sense is that if your view of the good and flourishing life includes having small children or children that have certain features, then it would be essentially costly for you to give up on your conception of the good life and adopt. So these are the sort of costs that both defenders and sort of detractors of the duty to adopt identify. So in the paper, I have this section on two of the costs that are obviously building on these insights, but are what I want to do with this cost is that are costs that are not simply easily done away with by political intervention. For example, financially costly could be so financially burdensome. We could cap, for example, agency fees. This happens already in other states, like in European states. So it doesn't seem to be something unattainable. And I also don't want to rely on costs that are like the essentially costly costs that are derived from a pre-existing desire to procreate. So I want to isolate, and let's see, you will tell me if I succeed. I want to isolate costs of adoption that do not derive from a pre-existing desire to procreate, but that are just because of the practice is organized in such a way that it makes it costly, regardless of whether you have a strong or not desire to procreate. Okay, so the first set of costs concern the demographics of children in care. So the sort of background question is, why is adoption costly and why it imposes much more than minimal costs on the rescuer? So the first reason is that children in care the vast majority of children in care are much older than, for example, between 2 and 3 or between 0 and 3. So, for example, I have some statistics in the paper. I don't have the paper with me because I was teaching, so I sort of rushed to this talk, so sorry. But basically, I remember some of them top of my head. And for example, in countries like the UK is like 2.8 children are under the age of 2 among all the children in institutional care. So all the children that could potentially be adopted. In Australia is 1.4, and in the States, I think is 3.6. But there is a certain variation between the numbers because some count 0 to 2, whereas other counts 0 to 3 or 0 to 4. So even in countries that count 0 to 4, the 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 children that are 0 to 4 are still the minority. So it's always under 3% and very often, sorry, always under 5% and very often under 3%. So in a sense, if you adopt a child, it's very, very, very likely that you will adopt a child that is 4 years old or older, 5 years old or older. And also the sort of vast majority are not just between 5 and 6 then, but are between like 10 and 15. So then there is a big gap again. So the second characteristic of the demographic of children awaiting adoption is that many of them are either disabled or they have various kinds of special needs. So the disabled children are the ones that were born disabled, and then there are children that have become disabled, or depending on your preferred view of how to refer to these groups, they are children with special needs that are often caused by sort of problems in attachment or neglect and abuse that they suffered either with the sort of birth families or in the transition phase while they've been placed in institution. But again, the vast majority of these children have one or the other issue. The second is the nature of, so the second set of costs derive from the nature of the adoption process. So adopting is true, is logistically complex, but it's also, it takes a really long time, and people who adopt are subjected to scrutiny in ways that, at least in liberal societies, procreative parents are not subjected to scrutiny. So this is one feature. The second feature is that so there is a lot of scrutiny actually pre-adoption and little support post-adoption. So there are these, and again, one might think that this is possible, that we can change that, but I have a sort of response to this. But anyway, so lots of scrutiny. The second thing is that there's something unusual about adoption, which is when any member of the birth family is still alive, not just the parents, but in general, some members of the birth families are alive. The sort of adoptive parents, the good practice of adoption is that unless something very objectionable has happened, they need to encourage attachment, not just with them, but also with members of the birth families, and sort of maintain contact with this family. So this is again very different from procreation, where at least in the first few years of the child life, we have a sort of quite a lot of discretion over the sort of intimate relationship that our children, so the people with whom our children associate with. So this is the second. And this is especially salient in the context of adoption because the vast majority of children up for adoption, they are not technically orphans, but they have at least one living parent. So there are these UNICEF global statistics where only like 17% of children awaiting adoption are orphans in the sense that they have no living parents. But most of the children, the vast majority of the children, do have either one or both living parents. So I think these two costs set adoption apart from cases of procreation, even if one doesn't have a strong desire, a strong pre-existing desire to procreate. Now you might think, well, parenthood is hard. So of course there are all these costs, but there are also lots of costs associated with parenthood. And so it seems to the sort of person who might raise the objection that if you accept the cost of parenthood, you should also accept these additional costs. So I think this is true, but it's also true that the sort of early months and more controversially pregnancy, but definitely early months and early years are, if not essential, they are very important in terms of contributing to the development of the parent-child bond. And this is true for the parents, but it's also true for the children. So it's true that parenthood is hard, but it's particularly hard to parent a child that has been through lots of attachment that has had lots of attachment figures, some more dysfunctional than others. And then you need to start from a 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 9-year-old, rather than, for example, a newborn. On this, for example, oh, sorry. I was going to say something I forgot. Yeah, sort of the development of the child bond is also, the parent-child bond helps also to cement the sort of what comes after these initial first few months or years. So, for example, Frederick, who is one of the proponents of the duty to adopt, says that the first few months pale in comparison with everything else that happens later on, which in a sense is true, but at the same time is also true that they are important, and not just because they are sort of experiences one wants to have intrinsically, but also like instrumentally to cement the parent-child bond. Now, here, the thing that I want to say that I forgot is that, of course, parenting a newborn or being pregnant for people who can get pregnant and can gestate their children is also really hard. But again, the idea is that the flip side of this is that you start to develop this bond with the child. And there is lots of literature on, for example, the development of the child, the parent-child bond during pregnancy. And interesting, at least on my reading of the literature, is it's true also for non-gestating parents, sort of going to the appointments. And then there are all these things of like tying certain developmental milestone with sort of the kicking, the heartbeat, and so on. So it seems, at least on the face of it, that these experiences are quite important for the parent-child bond. The second is that I don't think necessarily procreation so reduces the chances of having disabled children or children need extra care. There is a big discussion, obviously, on the permissibility of abortion for these reasons, the sort of selective abortion where you select against disability. But in a sense, it's regardless of what one thinks of these, it's much harder to parent a child that needs extra care than a child that is sort of developmentally and in other ways adjusted. And this again, I want to stress it not just in a defensive way. This is not to say that this is not a judgment on the experience of parenting these children or sort of like or even the children themselves. It's more like a sort of appreciation of the cost in non-ideal circumstances. So the upshot of this view, the sort of like the cost, is that I think adoption is not a case of easy rescue. So the sort of drowning child and railroad are cases of easy rescue, quote unquote, where the cost to the rescuer are either minimal or non-existent. So these are considered in the literature cases of easy rescue. So I don't think in the current context of adoption is a case of easy rescue. But as a consequence of that, as if we accept my view that it's not an easy rescue case, then it's not enough to appeal to the sort of intuitions that these cases elicit in us, but also the principles governing them. So it might be true that we have a duty to adopt, but not if the principle just accounts or accommodates minimal costs. So here is the view. So here is a response that one might have, and indeed, actually, there are two strategies that in the literature, at least one is pursued in the literature, and the other I sort of made up myself. The one could pursue to respond to this view that is not an easy rescue case, and so we need to either change the principle or do some other things. Okay, so the first strategy is the one defended, for example, by Rulli. So Rulli is one of the most vocal proponents of the duty to adopt. So she says something like, it's true that in the current context, adoption is really hard. And she says, this might represent, I'm just checking if I have, no, I was checking if I have a quote. Oh, sorry, I do this every time. So I'm going to say what these two strategies are, and then I'm going to explain them. So there is the idea, well, adoption is hard in the current context, but we should reform it. And the second is modifying the principle being, if you can prevent something harmful from happening at little cost to oneself, then one is morally required to prevent it. So the first strategy is basically the one that is pursued by Rulli, who says, look, adoption in the current context is really hard. And she says also the current context of adoption might represent one of the strongest challenge to the duty to adopt. But she says many of these costs are contingent in the sense that they are amenable to human intervention. And so if we reform adoption, then, for example, children wouldn't be so old, they wouldn't be that neglected, more people would adopt them, so we will all be fine. So I think, so there is a first sort of general thought about the feasibility and desirability of adoption reform. So one of the reasons why I didn't want to rely on, for example, things like financial costs is that I do think that those costs seem to be amenable to human intervention, not because I don't appreciate the trade-offs that require funding adoption versus funding something else, but because many countries organize adoption policy in a way that it seems to mitigate these costs. But there are other costs that I think is unclear whether not just is feasible, but also is desirable to do away with. So, for example, it's true that there are very long waiting times, but usually there are long waiting times for good reasons, which is preventing unnecessary separations. Or it's true that between, for example, children and their birth families, or it's true that parents are often, or prospective adoptive parents are subjected to scrutiny, but again, you want to ensure suitability. Maybe, I mean, some of these practices are horrendous, actually, especially if you talk to people like same-sex couples. The type of question, especially gay men, that they get asked from social workers are like probably way too invasive and so on. But it's not that people don't adopt just because of this cost. They're like, is the whole process seems to be premised on the idea that you want to ensure suitability and you want to prevent unnecessary separations. So it's unclear to me that the sort of adoption reform response can settle all these questions about feasibility and desirability. But more problematically, and doesn't rely on any empirical claim, so this is a sort of conceptual response, or a sort of conceptually minded response to this adoption reform response. And it's the idea that I think one of the problems of this type of response is that the argument suffers from what I call selective idealization. So here is the idea. So the defenders of the duty to adopt say, look, the world is really bad, and that's why we have a duty to adopt, because there are all these children in these terrible circumstances, and therefore there is a duty to adopt. So they use the characteristics of the world as it is to get the duty to adopt off the ground. But then they say, look, if the world was different, adoption would be less costly. So I don't think the argument works because you idealize certain premises while relying on others being descriptively accurate. So I don't think this quite works, or at least this is my view of why the adoption response doesn't work. Because obviously, in some ways, if children weren't so abused and neglected, if they weren't lingering so much in institutions, if, then there wouldn't be a duty to adopt because many people would adopt. At least this is the case, because at least this seems to be the case, because smaller children, younger children are often, they actually are going up for adoption. So this is the response. Okay. So a second response to my objection to the duty to adopt in the current context is that, well, we have the principle which says that the little cost, so there can only be little cost to oneself. So one way to accommodate greater cost is making the principle what Singer calls the stronger interpretation of the principle. So so the idea is that, okay, we have this principle, the costs are a little, so we need to modify this part of the principle in order to accommodate greater cost. Sorry, I made this very convoluted. Okay, so Singer had two interpretations. So there is the moderate interpretation according to which one, and again, look at the principle if you can, one ought to not give up on something that is morally significant. But so the principle would be if one can prevent something harmful from occurring without sacrificing something morally significant, she ought to do it. So I think on this version of the principle, it's obvious that there is no duty to adopt, because it seems to me that people would be required to sacrifice something morally significant. But then there is a strong interpretation of the principle, which is the one that actually Singer favors in the paper, but says that even if we adopt the moderate interpretation, we would still need to change our way of life. So it's fine with the moderate interpretation. So on the strong interpretation, the harm prevented need to outweigh the cost incurred. So the principle would be, if one can prevent something harmful from occurring without sacrificing something comparably morally significant, then she's morally required to do it. But I think so if that's the principle that the duty relies on, then it seems that we are not just required to adopt children, we are required to do so many other things. So since there are all these other things that we could do that would prevent greater harm at lower cost to oneself. So this is also why, and this is also why I think if that's the principle, then the duty to adopt would not just fall on people who already wish to have children, but also people who do not want to have children, because obviously the cost of foregoing a child-free life would pale in comparison to save the life of the child. So so it's a sort of reduction. So I think if we take this interpretation of the principle, it's fine, but I don't think that the duty is anymore a perfect duty to rescue. It's maybe more an imperfect duty to aid. So we have all these ways in which we can help children, but we are not required to adopt them. We are required to sort of provide support in some ways. But again, this doesn't support the duty to adopt. So to sum up, the question is, do people who wish to have children have a duty to adopt rather than procreate? So I think in the current context, no, because it's not a case of easy rescue. We have considered adoption reform and a stronger interpretation of the principle, and I think neither quite works. And so this is the sort of an interim conclusion on the current context. Sorry, this is a bit patronizing, but it was for my students. Okay, so now I think it's good to keep this idea in mind that adoption is really hard, so it might not be required, but it might be supererogatory for us to pursue, given the cost that the rescuer would incur into. Okay, so the second part and shorter part of the paper goes into like sort of ideal cases of adoption. So hopefully in the current context, I convinced you that it's too costly and therefore there is no duty to adopt in the current context. But one might ask you, but what about ideal cases of adoption when most of the costs have been neutralized? Is there a duty to adopt then? So if we think about those costs, there is this, again, hypothetical by Rulli that I think fleshes out the kind of the kind of cases that we are considering. So she calls it safe haven because in the States, apparently, I've recently learned you can drop a child in a fire station and if you want to give them up for adoption. So safe haven says, imagine that you have just decided to become a parent. You learn that that at the local fire station, a safe haven has received a newborn in need of a family. You are aware of the research showing that early infant adoptions pose little risk regarding the infant's psychological health and potential for emotional attachment. The urgent need for placement and the lack of administrative costs allow for the baby's adoption with few additional hurdles or financial burdens. You can adopt this child who will otherwise face a life of uncertainty in various institutions or foster homes. Or you can decline and bring a new child into the world instead. So now the question is, you might not have a duty to adopt in the current context of adoption. Do you have a duty to adopt in safe haven? Okay, so there are some people, like for example, these are quite recent papers on this that says that you do not have a duty to adopt even in idealized cases, and they appeal to this idea of ground projects and also of integrity that draws on Bernard Williams. So here is the idea. So the idea is that there are certain projects which William in Moral Luck calls ground projects, where so that they are things, they are so tied to our identity that our whole way of being a moral agent is reliant on us having those projects. And so if we give up on these projects, we would lose our integrity in the sort of like, thinks of it as sort of the foundation of a house. So this is the integrity as in mind, not the sort of opposite of hypocrisy. So our wholeness as a moral agent would be fragmented if we were to give up on this project. So there are some people who think, and this is a quote from Reader, who says, an excellent candidate for the status of a normatively protected project is having a child. For many people, having a child is simply constitutive of having a good life. And then he continues, forming a family with or without a partner, raising another person according to one's values, and forming the unique bond of parenting with a child is often central to one's own self-conception and gives meaning to one's life. So according to Reader, there is no duty to adopt because we have prerogatives on the kind of projects we are allowed to pursue. And a candidate for one such project is procreation. Therefore, we shouldn't be under a duty to adopt. Now, so the reason why I'm pursuing this strategy, so there are actually two reasons. And the more I think about it, the more I think there are more two than one, is that I'm actually not sure. So this is the main reason. I'm actually not sure that not just the project of having children, but the procreative project actually counts as a normatively protected project. So it seemed to me that Reader is right, that there are Williams too, that there are certain things, certain projects that should be protected from the sort of deontic commitments that we might have, from the sort of duty that we have as moral agents. But I'm not sure that procreation, rather than just parenthood, is should be one such project. So this is I'd say this is the main reason. So my and I think maybe it's also like I can't just get my head around as to whether the interest in procreating is sufficiently strong to defeat the duty to adopt. So since I couldn't get my head around, but I still don't think this is the right way to think about it, here is my suggestion as to why this is not the right way to think about procreation and adoption. So my proposal is that we should resist this deontic framing. So the deontic framing is that we don't just have we don't just have reasons to adopt, but we have a duty to adopt. So consider this case. So these I've read it many times, and everyone thinks that I'm thinking about them, but in good because I don't like you guys, but I don't know you guys, not that I don't like. So I don't know, I can't. Nobody can think that I'm actually talking about you. So, but suppose you have just joined a new philosophy department and noticed two colleagues who you might befriend. So one is painfully isolated, call him loner. The other popular, enjoys a rich social life. You know that social isolation, correlates with serious harm, and you feel that befriending loner would be a good thing to do. Still, you feel naturally drawn to popular. So the question is, do you have a duty to befriend loner over popular? And there is a similar case, which I'm not going to go into, with romantic relationships. So imagine that somebody is single, but also really unhappily single, and someone is not. Do we have a duty to date them over somebody else? So I think the conditions of a sort of loner and sad bachelor, this is the other guy in the story, and also children awaiting adoption give us agent neutral reasons to adopt, but I'm not sure that they give rise to a duty to adopt. And the reason is that when we think about morality and deontic commitments in sort of domains of value, such as friendship, romantic relationship, and parenthood, I think with Wolf that the morality plays a role in shaping the way we act and the way we relate to each other, and also what we owe to each other in these domains. But, and this is the key part of the quote, we should be wary of the model of moral agency that would involve a constant attention to the question of moral permissibility. So I think when we think about parenthood and adoption, we have moral and non-moral reasons. Oh, no, sorry, this is a second. So when we think about, for example, parenthood and adoption, we have different reasons for engaging in these practices, and some of these reasons are moral, some of these reasons are not moral. But I think even if we don't think like Wolf that there is a strict separation between morality and value, even if we have a different metaethics and we think morality is all encompassing, I think that sort of reducing this question to questions of permissibility and impermissibility flattens the moral landscape. So you don't have to agree with sort of the metaethics, the Wolf's defense. You can also say they are moral practices and we have moral reasons to engage in them. But I just don't think that our moral reasons can be reduced to question of like duty and permissibility. Okay. So the second reason, and I mean, why we should resist this framing, and then I'm closing, is concern motivations. So when we engage in these practices, again, we have moral and non-moral reasons. So moral reasons could be, for example, we want to promote our and other people's flourishing, and this could be a moral reasons. But there are also non-moral reasons. So when we think about our existing friends, children, and romantic partner, and if our only reason to engage in this relationship would be to fulfill our duty to rescue, they might have a reasonable complaint like, are you just friend with me because you are fulfilling your duties to the world? So I think they might have, but not because it means that we don't value them, but rather, and this is Stoker on this, rather because duty, obligation, and rightness are only one part of ethics. There is the whole other area of the values of personal, interpersonal relations and activities, and also the area of moral goodness, merit, and virtue. In both, motive is an essential part of what is valuable. In both, motive and reason must be in harmony for the value to be realized. So if our motivations are just, I need to fulfill a duty, it seems to me that we are valuing not just the child, the friend, and the romantic partner in the wrong way, but also we are not really understanding what it is to have friends, romantic partners, and being parents. So I think there is a sort of distortion of the kind of practice that motivated us to act in the first place. So following Wolf and also Stoker, the decision to procreate, I think, is better understood as a decision to shape one's life, participate in a shared human practice, and form meaningful relationships. And therefore, I think the deontic framework is insufficient to address questions concerning the morality of procreation because it reduces the morality of procreation to what is permissible to do in a certain context. Okay, so to sum up, and then I'm closing. Sorry for going. Well, on my timer I'm not, but now I'm looking at the clock and I am sorry. So, do people who wish to have children have a duty to adopt rather than procreate in safe haven? So, I think even if parenthood, procreation, and adoption are moral practices, we shouldn't think of them just as something that is permissible or impermissible to engage with, but we should think of them as domains of value. So when the moral reasons are broader than just permissibility, than what permissibility can capture. And so children's circumstances will give us agent neutral reasons for action, but they are not by themselves giving rise to a duty to adopt, I think. So, do people have a duty to adopt rather than procreate? I think not in the current context, and also probably not in idealized cases of adoption.